Hello, I am Anupam Thombre, professional wildlife photographer and a mentor. Welcome back to the post processing showcase, and this is the third video in this series. I hope you have a good time going through this session. Today, we are looking at this lovely image of this male tiger standing below the tree with some filtered light seeping through the canopy. The image is tack sharp and needs no additional sharpening. We are going to post process this image from start to end using Adobe Lightroom Classic only. Let's start by collapsing the left and the bottom panel. Press R on your keyboard to open the crop menu. To toggle between the different crop overlays, the shortcut key is O. I am keeping the face of the tiger in the center by using the overlay and placing it in the center. I am going to keep the aspect ratio of 2:3. When working only with Lightroom, I am keeping the profile to Adobe Color. The shortcut to open the white balance selector tool is W. Do make sure to find a neutral color which is gray and make sure that all the values of the red, green and blue are the same. At least the first two numbers before the decimal point. Once the same values are found, click and set the white balance. Always make sure to reset the tint slider by double tapping on the knob. I am reducing the exposure very slightly and setting it to minus 0.35. Next, I am going to flatten the image tones by reducing the highlights completely and increasing the shadows completely. I am now setting the whites to 9 and blacks to minus 7 and create a good contrast in the image. I am also strengthening the contrast by working on the tone curve by setting the lights to 4 and the darks to minus 4, creating an S curve. I'm setting the vibrance to 12 and saturation to 3 and revisiting the white balance slider to make sure the white remains white. Also, after bumping up the blue primary saturation, I'm revisiting the white balance again. By pressing the Alt on Windows or Command on Mac and dragging the masking slider, I will set my sharpening range as shown so that only my tiger retains the sharpness. I'm not changing any other values there. I also make sure that the remove chromatic aberration and enable profile correction are enabled. I am selecting the point color, a very new feature in the Lightroom Classic, and taking samples of various colors and altering their hue, saturation, and luminance as required. Visualize range shows me the presence of that specific color throughout the image. Once I get my perfect range, I proceed to set the values of hue, saturation, and luminance for individual samples of colors. Once this is done, I again visit the white balance and slightly adjust it for the last time. You can open the masking menu by pressing Shift plus W. These are the available types of masks provided by Lightroom Classic, but only 4 masks are important for us: the brush, linear gradient, radial gradient, and the range. Let's start with the radial gradient and first cover the eyes. Once the first radial gradient is drawn over the eye, I am going to subtract the unnecessary surrounding areas by using the subtract button using brush. That touch off that you see here is me firing up my Wacom Intuos Pro Pen and Touch tablet. Reducing the feather slightly, I brush off the unwanted areas. Once the area is cleaned, I intersect this mask with luminance range. This is the luminance range slider. It represents all the tones on the histogram from black to white. I set the luminance range to highlights and add a little feather. I stop when I get the perfect selection of the highlights inside the eye. Once this is achieved, I apply the effect by increasing the exposure slider slightly. The effect is applied only for the selected highlights area inside the eye that I selected. I follow the same procedure for the second eye. Create the mask, subtract the unnecessary areas, intersect with luminance range, and set the target for highlights and whites. I increase the exposure here as well to make the eye bright. Now I'm selecting only the catch light using the radial filter. Intersecting the mask with the luminance range and increasing the brightness. Same process is carried out on the second eye. Intersecting the mask with the luminance range and increasing the brightness. This lights up the catch lights beautifully. Staying on this eye, I make the selection of the shadows in the eye. Intersect the mask with luminance range, and this time I select only the shadows by moving the slider from right to left. Once the desired area is selected, the same process is carried out in the second eye. Intersect the mask with luminance range, I reduce the exposure and the shadows to enhance the shadows in the upper parts of the eye. Now I am using the brush, and after increasing the feather very slightly, I am selecting the lower parts of the eye. After intersecting the brush with luminance range, I select the shadows on the lower border of the eye. The exposure is slightly reduced to create a contrast in the eye. I repeat the same procedure on the other eye. This procedure creates a multi layered effect on the eyes. I am now selecting the minute highlights just below the eyes by selecting the brush and intersecting them with the luminance range and setting the target to highlights and whites. Increase the brightness and create a nice separation. I repeat the same procedure on the other eye. This is before and after with the steps done till now. Now I start working on the fur on the left side of the face. Like shown before, I keep intersecting the main mask with luminance range and create desired selections and increase the exposure to create a nice glow. By now, you will have got an idea on how to work with the masks and the luminance range. Here I erased a small section as it was too bright already and didn't need more exposure. Now let's work on the right side of the fur on the face. Now the ears. This time I have selected both the ears in the same selection. Do you see that beautiful light on the bridge of the tiger's nose? Let's enhance it now. The same process is used. Now selecting the nose of the tiger and following the same luminance range process. When the luminance slider goes from right to left, it's the shadows selection, while from left to right, it's the highlight selection. Here I am now brushing to select the shadows on the nose. Once the shadows range is selected, I am erasing the unnecessary areas and creating a clean selection. And I reduce the shadows slider to slightly darken the areas. Proceeding to work on the legs, which are slightly bright. Using the radial gradient, I intersect it with luminance range and select only the highlights and the whites. Then I tone down the bright areas by reducing the exposure and highlight slider. This brings the brightness in control. Similarly, I tackle the bright patch on the other leg. Here I am now selecting the color range with the pick dropper tool and selecting the greens in the background. The parts of the tiger also get selected because of the combination of yellows and the greens. I work on the slider to narrow down the range and select only the greens and that too the highlights. Once done, I enhance the highlights in this area. Now I'm working on the dry leaves near the feet of the tiger. I'm using the linear gradient. I'm controlling the colors using temperature and tint slider. Let's tackle this bright area in the background. I'm making the selection using the radial gradient and then subtracting the area from the tiger using the brush. Once done, I simply intersect the mask with the luminance range and target only the highlights and the whites to reduce the brightness. Using highlights and exposure slider to match with the background. I am now selecting the face and increasing a little bit of lights, texture, and clarity. The same is followed on the chin. I am now using the linear gradient to select the tree trunk on the right. I intersect it with highlights and whites. and increase the highlights, whites, temperature, and the tint. Again, I draw the next linear gradient at the same location, and after subtracting the tiger's hind portion from this mask, I intersect the mask with luminance range, and this time I target the shadows, enhancing the shadows and applying cooler temperature. I just check for the before and after and notice that the left eye is slightly dull when compared to the right eye. So I am selecting the existing mask for the highlights of the left eye and slightly increasing the brightness more, and this time it looks balanced. This ends the selective workflow and the final image is created. Let's see the before and after, and this is the before and after presented side by side by pressing Y. I hope you enjoyed this short processing video and got to understand some techniques which I use from time to time when processing only in Lightroom, which is quite rare actually. Do not forget to subscribe and press the bell icon so that when I create a learning video like this, you will be immediately notified. See you in the next showcase video.